Today's workshop. Today we'll be talking a little bit about academic writing. So we'll be going through lots of different points. Academic writing is something that everyone in this room will, have to do a lot through their time as a student here at Wolfson. So we're just going to go through some tips on how to get started in the first place, through some really common problems that come up with academic writing, obviously writer's block, but things like perfectionism as well can be a real big obstacle when it comes to academic writing. And then also we'll have some a discussion around style as well. And then finally, we'll talk about academic writing sort of as a process that is, a part of note making and also editing as well. So we'll talk a little bit about proofreading your work at the end of the workshop as well. So, yeah, so this is our agenda basically. It's my very catchy title split into 4 parts with the little proofreading added at the end. So I hope that sounds good to everyone. If you do have any questions, please do interrupt me. That's absolutely fine, and we'll get started. So on the topic of getting started, let's go into that. So the two things that I want to talk to you about are firstly some conceptualizations of writing, and then also some approaches to writing schedules. See, conceptualizations of writing are different ways of thinking about writing, right? That helps us to sort of understand what we're doing when we go into a writing project, right? Because if you have an essay, for example, or you have any kind of work that requires writing, then it can be useful to think like, okay, well, actually, writing is quite a broad topic, right? Like you want to think specifically, what type of writing am I doing? How do I conceptualize my own writing so that you can be more intentional going into your work? So there are three that I've sort of picked out. The first one I think is the most important of all three. And that's this idea of writing as thinking. So you guys have probably had this experience before where so basically you've done most of the reading, but you don't know exactly what you're going to say. And then you sit down and write, and then all of a sudden, this beautiful idea comes to you as you're writing, right? It's this idea that something magical happens when you're writing, that like the ideas are all swirling around in your head, and you're doing the very sort of like Zen flow state thing of writing, and ideas come to you as you're writing. So it's like writing can be in a way, part of the research process in that sense, because you don't have all your ideas prior to getting your thoughts down via writing. So it actually helps clarify the writing. So yeah, that's one thing I wanted to sort of highlight as well as in part of this section is that you actually don't have to do all of the reading before you start writing, right? Like I think sometimes people see, okay, I'm going to do all the reading. I'm going to, I've got 10 articles. I'm going to do all of them, blast through them, and then I can start writing. But actually, if you take into account this idea that actually writing is one of the best ways to think, to get all your ideas out, then actually it can be a useful thing to start writing, in the reading process. And also, if you were at our sort of reading and note making workshop a couple of weeks ago, then we were talking a lot about how it's really important when you're doing your reading to have a really clear essay question, right? And so I think a lot of the time we go into reading without a really clear question or without a really clear idea. So if you do sort of like go back and forth between reading and writing, then maybe actually they can be like mutually beneficial because, the reading informs the writing, and then the writing, which when you generate ideas, informs the reading as well. We have another person coming in. There you go. Um, so yeah, so writing really clarifies your thinking. It also, because you have the writing sort of laid out in front of you, right? You can have one idea here, one idea there. It can allow you to make connections in a really interesting way, especially if you have really well-made notes. And of course, this is kind of the culmination of all of our workshops, isn't it, right? Like we have the reading and note making, but we also have, yeah, sorry, the reading one and also the note making one. If you have really clear notes, like the thematic matrix, for example, if you see, okay, well, I've got this on this theme and this on that theme, then seeing them visually sat next to one another can allow you to make connections that you might not have been able to make otherwise. So yeah, I think breaking down this idea that I'm going to do all my research process and get all my plan and all my idea first of all, and then I'm going to do writing, actually, they're a much more combined process. Um, And also, if you struggle to start, then maybe the idea of conceptualizing writing as thinking kind of takes the pressure off. Like sometimes you think, I need to, write as though I'm this like incredibly like Einsteinian sort of genius. But actually, getting stuff on the page can be made a lot easier if you just think, I'm just thinking out loud, right? Like whatever's in my brain, I'm just putting on the page. So that can be useful potentially. Um, so the second conceptualization of writing is this idea of writing as conversation, right? And this is one that I really love as a humanities subject, but I do think that like this can be, extrapolated into all subjects, is this idea that you're in conversation with all of the people that you really admire. And so if you think maybe that your writing is, I don't know, you might have imposter syndrome and you have this impression that your own writing is quite trivial. Well, actually, it can really legitimize your sense of your own work by putting yourself in conversation, right, with the people that you really admire. So, I'm doing a essay on aestheticism. I'm in a way talking to Walter Pater, Oscar Wilde, Michael Field, and all of a sudden it's this really motivating idea that you have like all of these like incredible minds in front of you that you can discover sort of truths with. And it can be really generative of writing because instead of having to produce a monologue with no back and forth, actually you can be bouncing ideas and that can create a really nice flow in your writing. Because writing is a social act, right? It ultimately isn't a monologue. It's only a monologue whilst you're, sat in your room and you don't show it to anyone. The minute you give it to someone, it becomes a dialogue, right? You always have the reader in mind. So this idea of the reader as well, bigger than this conversation with, brilliant writers who you admire, there's also like this idea that I'm going to give this to my supervisor and I want my supervisor to understand it. I might share this with my friends to proofread. I want them to understand it. And being pro-reader um, is yeah, this quite generative feeling, I think, in creating like good style, good ideas. And if you read it back and you think, oh, my friend would criticize this in a certain way, then actually that can be a really helpful way of thinking about it. Um, so we're just having more people join, but that's absolutely fine. Um, and then finally, this idea of writing as research, which I sort of touched on a little bit earlier. So for many academics, writing is an essential part of the research process, right? A generative task, a form of thinking. So as I was saying, writing as thinking means that like the research process is, like uses writing as a key fundamental part of it. And so, of course, the opposite is true, right? Research can also become a form of pre-writing. And I think this is a really important idea. I think being able to produce writing in your research phase can just totally eradicate that blank page panic, which I know I struggled with quite a lot. If you see maybe you have a really detailed plan, but ultimately it doesn't have any writing in it. So there's no like scaffolding that I can hook myself onto. There's no like imaginary first sentence, for example. Um, but actually, if you write kind of like discursive notes whilst you're researching, um, and is the with this idea that like researching and writing can be this quite cyclical, quite like blurred boundary thing, then the act of starting writing becomes a lot easier. So yeah, the tasks of creating an essay, the things that we've kind of been going through with all of these workshops, time management, research, literature searching, note making, or everything, it all kind of doesn't happen in a linear fashion, right? Like it all comes together at the end with writing potentially as the last thing. But I do think it's seeing it as this process, as this cycle, where you don't have to do one and then the other and then the other, can be really helpful. So yeah, reading everything with your essay question in mind can allow you to have your notes be a form of pre-writing, right? Like all of the notes are really relevant. It can even be like copy and pasted in and become like writing prompts almost. Um, okay, so the other thing to do with getting started is understanding your own writing schedule. This one's really important because habits are, such a powerful tool in, getting yourself writing sustainably. So this is something that I want to put a load of emphasis on because I know that like burnout is a real thing at Cambridge, as it is in any university. So writing sustainably is something that I feel quite passionately about. So yeah, I've got three different types of writing schedules that all have their sort of pros and cons in their own way. And as I'm going through them, I would just ask you to be reflective and think about your own writing style and which one of these sort of resonates with you, and if you'd like to change or modify your writing schedule as we go through. So the first one is spontaneous writing. So this one can be if you're an extremely busy person and you just have to find time wherever you can find time. So this is the type of people that will do their writing either in a notepad that they keep on themselves or in their notes app in their phone. And it really is, I have 10 minutes while I'm waiting for my friend, and I'm going to write here now. And it's very like ready to write at the drop of a hat. So in that sense, it's really good because you know, you don't really ever lose contact with your project. Like it's kind of always swirling around in your mind. You always can, anytime you have a good idea, it can go right onto the page. And also there's that quick start sort of ability in these people, where, instead of like wasting a couple minutes on TikTok or whatever, you can do another couple minutes of the writing. And that could be one paragraph in half an hour, and then you don't touch it for the rest of the day until maybe like 1 a.m. And then there's another paragraph, for example. Um, the downside of this is that you never really have that deep work that comes from writing for, over 45 minutes. Um, and so some people think that means you're never going to really bring your A game. I do think that, like, in terms of creating big ideas, this isn't something that's going to really work, but maybe in the earlier phases of a chapter of an essay, this can be something that really works for people. I know with creative writing in particular, I think this is the way that a lot of people work, um, but it's not really advisable long term for essay writing. Um, the second one is daily writing. This is kind of considered the gold standard of writing productivity, in the sense that it can really like improve your like what's the word? Consistency, and can make sure basically, yeah, as I've written down here, that allows you to weather the storm of low points in your writing. So if you are writing daily and, inspiration strikes, for a good long week and you're having a really good time, and then the next week it's really hard, but actually, if you're writing daily, then it's okay, you can get through that, and then you come back the next day, and then you've got an idea and you're back in. So that bad day can be chalked up to just a bad day, rather than if you're writing, in these like confetti ways, the like really spontaneous writing, then having no inspiration can be really debilitating, because that person only writes when they're inspired, right? Whereas the daily writer will force himself to sit down at the same time, in the same place, and it creates a really productive habit. So this is the one that I think is the best for mental health. I think it's the best one for producing writing on time so that you don't get burnt out and you don't have that sort of last minute panic. Um, but this doesn't work for everyone. I think everyone is, very much particular about their writing style. I mean, for me personally, I had to have like, like a candle lit and three different drinks. I would have like a hot drink, a cold drink, a fizzy drink, and I would have, all of these different things that have to happen in order for me to feel really productive. And so, I would have that sort of like very creative style of writing, which doesn't necessarily fit with this idea of, okay, I'm gonna every morning at 10 a.m. I write for 2 hours. It might not be for you. But if you can get into this habit, I think it's a really good way of being productive. And then some people, finally, are the binge writers. So this one I think everyone is guilty of to a certain extent. I don't know if a single person hasn't reached a deadline and gone, I've not done enough, I'm going to have to do an all-nighter. However, binge writing can be productive or harmful depending on the person. And it really depends if you are cramming before a deadline and if it's leaving you burnt out and exhausted. So I want to be careful when I use the word binge writing. right? So binge writing can be that like, oh, I've not done enough work and I'm like really cramming before the end of a deadline, or it can be something that is called the grand gesture approach in this sort of theory of academic writing. And the grand gesture approach is basically saying, okay, if you're a very busy person and you have lots of commitments, then the grand gesture approach means that you are going to dedicate 3 days and you're not going to do anything else but write during those 3 days. And it might even be you're going to make a sort of financial investment, right? You might go to a hotel and do a lot of writing there. You might come to the writing retreat that we're hosting in January, or you might have come to the write-a-thon, for example. These are ways of being like almost romantic to your essay in the sense that you're saying, okay, nothing is more, for these like couple days or for this day, nothing is more important than you. And you legitimize it as well sometimes if you say, for example, buy a really lovely notebook or you buy a really lovely pen and you dedicate all this time to it. And so it's this sort of like big gesture and then you spend, an enormous chunk of time on it. And that type of writing I think is really productive. And so it is, in a sense, can be binge writing in that you're writing, it might be for 3 days straight, and then you take a week break, for example, which, in other situations that might look like, oh, this person doesn't have a regular habit, they're not writing daily. Um, but, if it is this like productive way of writing in a big, big chunk, I think that can be really productive. The other thing is if you are finding yourself binge writing quite a lot in a negative way, in a way that leaves you feeling quite exhausted, then I do think this is a moment to sort of reflect and think about motivation. Um, Motivation is truly like the most important thing in not only getting your work done in the first place, but also getting good work done. Because having that enthusiasm is really like visible in your work. And I personally believe that procrastination doesn't really have anything to do with laziness or like work ethic. I really think that procrastination is kind of like a coping mechanism to sort of stave off negative feelings. And so if you do find yourself procrastinating quite a lot, sometimes it can be helpful to interrogate those negative feelings. When I sit down to write, why do I have like quite strong negative emotions? And trying to piece that out for yourself, or talking about it with your friend, or journaling, whatever it might be, so that that negative feeling can have a name, first of all. And it might be imposter syndrome, it might be perfectionism, it might be a number of different things. You all have lives outside of this as well. So I think, yeah, investigating that and being compassionate to yourself if you are struggling with this kind of writing. So I hope you guys have had a little think about what your own writing sort of looks like. Um, so yeah, exactly. I think ultimately, good writing looks like using all three, right? Like none of them are bad in any sense, and also no one does only the one, right? I think it's useful to, have an idea at 2 a.m. and write it down. I think it's useful to get into a habit when you just need to get the work out and you need to weather those bad storms. And then also, doing those grand gestures as well can all be used in combination. The key thing here is being intentional. So if you are writing sort of without really thinking about it, that can lead to burnout. It can lead to writing for no real reason. Um, and just being intentional about your routine can really change the game in terms of how you feel about your own sort of work schedule and your work life. Um, so yeah, something that I would recommend is setting artificial deadlines in terms of getting the work done. This is, things that you guys will have heard of 1,000 times before. And also that done is better than perfect. Again, a bit of a cliche, but it's always these very simple things that bear repeating time and time again because it's the simple things that we forget and the simple things that are the most important as well. Um, so moving on, we're going to talk a little bit about getting unstuck. Okay, so I hope this is really useful to everyone because I know that writer's block is a huge problem sort of across the board. You can be writing, writing, writing in the flow state, and then all of a sudden it's just gone. So we're going to talk about it a little bit now. Um, so writing is hard. This is just something that we all know, right? I find writing hard, you find writing hard, Kafka finds writing absolutely tormenting, right? He writes, the end of writing, when will it take me up again? Again, tried to write, virtually useless, the old incapacity, right? Even the rich and the famous find writing absolutely abominable at times, and inspiration can really, be not forthcoming. And also, it's as I said previously, like my writing style, I needed a bunch of really specific stuff around me. Patricia Highsmith, you might know, who's written like 22 novels, five of them turned into films, an incredibly successful woman, has a really particular writing style as well. So she has to be surrounded by cigarettes, ashtrays, matches, a mug of coffee, a donut. So if you find writing difficult and you have a very specific way that gets you through that, then I think lean into that very specific way, right? Like, I can give you all of the advice in the world, but it's such a personal thing and it's such a, yeah, particular, unique, and individual process. You're like sat, it's just between you and the page. So you need to figure out what's going to work for you. But we'll have a couple tips that we'll go through. So first of all, writer's block. So writer's block occurs for an enormous number of reasons, which is why it's so common, right? Um, so a couple of you might be adjusting to a new form of writing. For example, you may be coming back to study after a long time, or you may be transitioning from A levels to university in the first place. And that is a big adjustment. And I think there is a temptation to, just be this genius person who can just do these things, right? But I think it's so important to remember that while we are at university, we are a student. And what that means is we're learning, okay? We don't come here to just show off that you have all the skills already. You come here to learn the skills in the first place. And so, meeting something new, like this new form of essay writing, I think it's so normal to be like, okay, what on earth even is this? And then, having that sort of like transition teething problems. So that can cause writer's block because you can have this like um, yeah, this sudden feeling of, oh, I can't do it. It's brand new. Um, there can also be people who have a very critical voice in their heads basically, and that voice can come from a number of places. It can come, from yourself or from an old supervisor. It can come from, friends who have read your reading or whatever it is. Um, and that can be really debilitating because writing with that voice in your head, obviously you're going to struggle. So identifying that and trying to take control over that narrative is something that can be really important as well. Um, Working with limited time or loads of time. This is, yeah, surprisingly, the one with loads of time can be the one that gives you the most writer's block because when you reach that moment of, as I was talking about with procrastination, you reach that moment of a negative feeling, and then if you have loads of time, there's nothing forcing you to stay by your laptop or by your writing, so it's quite easy to jump out. Um, with limited time as well, I feel like yeah, that is just one that like if you are anxious or stressed or panicked, then it is just going to be harder to write. Life as well, we all have lives outside of writing, and then perfectionism, which I will touch on in more detail later. So, working through writer's block, the ways to get through it, in my opinion, are to identify your strengths. So, first of all, it's about being really positive, right? Replacing all those negative feelings with positive ones. Okay? So, oftentimes people who are experiencing writer's block or anxiety have kind of a worse opinion of their own writing than anyone else. Everyone else thinks that the writing is fine except for you. So, one thing that can be really useful is to identify all of the things that you do well. You could even ask a friend or a colleague or a supervisor to help you do that. So you can start a bunch of sentences with "I am a writer who can dot dot dot," and that might be really useful to have not only like as a activity and a task, but also then as a resource to like put on the wall and just as a reminder as well. Um, the other one is to expect obstacles as a natural part of writing. Um, I think there's this emphasis on flow state as this like ideal sort of writing. and that if you aren't in flow, then somehow you're a bad writer, or that like something's gone wrong, you've not done enough reading. But actually, obstacles can and will come up, right? Like they are something that will are so common and happen to everyone. So taking on those obstacles and when they come, not being critical and understanding that like this obstacle was always going to come and it has nothing to do with you. Um, and recognizing that you're a student. So this is kind of what I was talking about earlier, is that you're here to learn, right? You're learning a lot of new things. It's a new format. They are potentially a lot longer than the writing that you've done before. You might be writing a whole thesis, which is, 20,000 words potentially. It's for a new audience. It might be more academic than you've done before. Um, and it could be like different like writing processes that maybe your supervisor has something really specific that they want you to do that is different from a different supervisor, right? And you're just adjusting to that. Um, uh, and so understanding that those things are like normal and happen to everyone is, yeah, as I said before, really useful. And then finally, recapturing your enthusiasm. This is one that I feel really passionate about because when I was writing, um, you know, I would find out what made me the most angry in the reading, and I would always find out if I could get, you know, sort of like annoyed basically at something that someone had said, then I could write a really amazing essay because I was personally involved and I was enthusiastic and I was passionate and I was motivated to gather all my evidence because I didn't want anyone to prove me wrong. And I would write with this sort of fervor and enthusiasm, basically. So if you have writer's block, it can be that you've forgotten what made you excited and motivated in the first place to write the essay. And so, for example, if you're a film student, that might be, one particular scene that inspired you. If you're, working in STEM, it might be, even further back than that, like thinking about, the reasons in the first place why you chose the subject. But in each essay, there will be some kernel of enthusiasm that takes you back to why you're doing the masters. So thinking about your own motivation, the masters or the undergrad or the PhD, of course. So yeah, taking a moment to think about what is it that captured my imagination, right, about this essay, and how can I lean into that passion so that I can write not only more but also better as well. Um, okay, we're going to take 5 minutes to do some free writing. So I don't know if you have ever done free writing before or heard of it, but it is one of the most useful things that you can do for writer's blog, okay? So this is basically an extension of the idea that writing is a form of thinking. So if you do have like this total blank page panic, what you can do is basically just write for a set amount of time without any judgment and without stopping as well. So the only caveat is that you write continuously and you do not use the delete key the entire time. And totally without judgment. So even if what you're writing is complete nonsense, it is still useful. This is something that Julia Cameron swears by. I don't know if you've heard of the artist's way, but it's quite a famous like thing that artists do to sort of like flush out their ideas and to create like a really good sense of self in their art. I know Dochi did it, and she like published it all on YouTube, so that's there to view if you would like to. But a key part of the artist way is to do two A4 pages of free writing every single day, which for some people is life-changing. And I know that free writing has really helped me in the past. When I feel as though I have no ideas, I'm totally demotivated. Um, and being really critical of what I'm writing, actually just writing without judgment for 5 minutes, you find out that you had way more ideas than you thought you did. Or, you've got all these ideas jumbled in your head and it's hard to put one before the other before the next. Free writing can help you to sort of find a flow maybe as well. So some tips and tricks for the free writing. If you feel stuck, do move on. If you think you need to look something up, don't, because we are writing continuously. Just make a note in the brackets, no, make a note in brackets, sorry, with a little question mark. And then I'll call time at the end of 5 minutes, and then we'll have another 3 minutes to do a light edit by moving stuff around. Not any real polish or anything, just a moment to read over what you've written and see if it's useful. Um, and of course, you can delete anything that's crazy, because when you're free writing, things may come out. But I think that's good. Anything that's on your brain, just put it on the page, and we'll see what happens. So, okay, let's say it is 10:40 now. So I'm going to leave you to write continuously, um, starting now. Okay, everyone. I hope that was very helpful for everyone, and they have been able to write a fair amount. So I'm just going to show you some stuff you can do after the free write, and then I'll give you 3 minutes to just have a little read through over what you've written. So after you've done your free write, it can feel like, okay, well, I've got this, sort of mad hodgepodge of ideas. How can I then make something useful out of it? Um, well, some things you can do is a side-by-side rewrite. So I think basically one thing that I find really frustrating is like making my quite informal writing into something more formal by like just changing one word or two within the sentence and trying to rejig the sentence. So usually what I end up doing is having basically another blank document next to my free write, and I will totally rewrite the whole thing. Um, from start to end. And I think that is, yeah, a more useful way of making it more formal, and it feels like a translation rather than a revision. It can be like a way of upgrading it rather than like editing it. I think is a really useful way of going about editing the free write. Equally, if you have a bunch of quite, hodgepodge ideas that are all sort of like in there, so it's good that you've gotten them out in the first place. You have the ideas now, but you need to create paragraphs with them. I know it can be quite simplistic. However, paragraph recipes, even the ones that we learned, way back when in high school, can be really useful. I don't know if you guys remember Peel. It's point, evidence, explain, link. So I won't go through that with you guys because I'm sure some of you remember it from high school. But thinking about these paragraph recipes, getting each of your ideas out of the free write, and then creating, okay, what is my point? How am I going to justify it? Going into a bit more detail, yeah, making it relevant to your essay question, all of these things that are, in a way quite basic, but as I said, all of the basic things are the most important. That can be a really useful way of separating all out and making something like really cogent from it. The Manchester Phrase Bank, something really helpful and useful, something to look up as well. It's basically an enormous long list of different sort of set phrases that people use in essays. So this can be like there's a big long section on expressing doubt or trying to convey something without total certainty or conveying something with total certainty, for example. So this can be really useful if you've used the word although, 10,000 times already in your essay. It can be really useful for that. And it can also be really useful for like transforming a free write, which is quite informal, into something that, feels and sounds like an essay. So that's something I would definitely check out, especially if English is not your first language. I think this is one that can become like really invaluable for certain people. And then also finally, there's this idea of reverse outlining. Um, so normally you have an outline and then you make an essay. Reverse outline is just doing that in reverse. So you have the essay and then from that you create what the outline would have been. So if your free write, actually looks quite good, but you want to understand sort of the scaffolding, the structure of it, then being like, okay, well, I introduce this idea first, and then I have a paragraph on this, and then a paragraph on this, and outline it sort of um, in the opposite direction can be really useful. Okay, so I'm going to give you until yeah 10:50 to have a look over your free write and see if there's anything that you can do to edit it. All right, everyone. I know that's not a huge amount of time, but hopefully, if it is something that you've created that you find really useful, of course, do go back to it, and you'll have more time to do it later. But we're going to move on now. So perfectionism. This is something that I've introduced as a result of the podcast that I did quite recently with some of our PhD students where basically one of the key things that came up was this idea that perfectionism was really one of the key things that was stopping them from being able to write. Um, so basically, what is perfectionism in the first place? It is having unrealistic standards, being highly self-critical, this sort of results-based focus rather than effort-based. So even if you did your very best try, if you didn't get an A star, then it doesn't matter for some reason. And then also this fear of failure as well. So these are all things that are very relatable and very understandable, and they can be really debilitating when it comes to writing. So if it sounds like you, then there are a few things that you can do moving forward. So the first thing to do is to set realistic expectations. So to always be intentional and conscious about the expectations that you set for yourself. This can be, even just like setting SMART goals. I don't know if you've heard of like, specific, measurable, achievable, etc. So making sure your goals can all be realized. Um, Equally, in the podcast that came out on Friday, which I obviously recommend that you guys listen to, but there was one PhD student who had worked in the civil service, and actually that experience really sort of helped him to write with sort of more functionality and also to um, write more, basically, because it had to be out at really quick deadlines, and it didn't have to be, flowery. It just had to do what it was doing, and it revolutionized his writing, basically. So if you treat yourself like, this worker that has to produce things on a regular basis, then I think, yeah, that can be a really useful thing. Um, so reaching out to friends and supervisors. So sometimes you can think that maybe these like unrealistic goals are coming from people in your life, but actually reaching out and explaining the situation can be really helpful. If you communicate to your supervisors that you're overburdened, they will simply try to help you, right? Like they want what's best for you. They're teaching you all these things because they want it to go in, because they want you to get something out of it. So if you admit to them, actually, I want to do this to the best of my ability and I feel like I can't, then that's something that they will be able to manage and do something about. Another one is to try and divorce your sense of self-worth from your work, which I know is crazy and impossible to do. However, gaining perspective on what really matters, which is in some certain aspects, your work and, the things that you produce, but it's also a lot of other things, right? Like it's important to have like place importance on a lot of different aspects of your life. So sometimes it can be, you can be really in this sort of bubble of Cambridge or whatever the work you're doing is. And sometimes it's useful to pop that bubble, going home, seeing your family, or whatever it might be, getting out to the countryside, gaining perspective on in life what really matters to you. And it should be work, but it also should be lots of different things as well. So practicing self-compassion. So we were talking about that negative like self-monologue, or it might be that like this voice has a different like person's voice, for example. Taking control of that narrative, as I was saying before. And then also, if it is becoming an issue, I would recommend to speak to our lovely, lovely student welfare advisor, who's called Kirsten, who is a angel. So I'd highly recommend to give her an email or to pop in and say hello to her. Um, okay, so back to writer's block. One really important way of getting over writer's block is using templates, right? Templates can be a way to think about your writing basically and take control of it. So what it does is it gives form, right, to what is otherwise like all these like ideas that are jumping around. Um, and so, yeah. giving form is not easy, right? Like if you don't know what the essay is supposed to look like, then it's kind of impossible to create it in the first place. Like you might have all of the best ideas in the world, but it's impossible to you know, create them into this cogent thing because you might not know what a geography essay looks like or what a history essay looks like. So using a template is, yeah, really empowering in those senses. And it also provides boundaries for those of us who love the subject and are including everything, right? I know a lot of people who think, well, I've started this essay question, but it's quite broad, and I'm reading around it and I love it, but I'm finding it difficult to turn it into an essay because it's such a big idea. Well, the template will show you immediately what can go into the essay and what can't, right? Like it excludes quite a lot, so that if you, especially if this is like a 2,000 word essay or a 4,000 word essay, then it will be quite narrow in scope, right? So having that like something to force you to exclude a decent amount of stuff in the first place can make your essay writing process a lot more streamlined. Um, okay, so using a past paper is probably the key way of templates, right? Um, it's basically impossible to write what you've never seen before, especially if you're coming back to writing after a long time or you're transitioning into uni, then this is something that I would highly recommend. We have two databases that are available on our LibGuide. The first one is called ProQuest Dissertations and Theses, and the second one is called Networked Digital Library of Theses and Dissertations. This is for like critical pedagogy and for scholars of the global south. All this is incredibly useful, and I would highly recommend using a past paper. Um, to get the function, right? Not the content necessarily. So what I mean by that is that it will be potentially impossible to find an essay that is on your exact topic. And also if it isn't your exact topic, then um, you know, what it's already been done before, or you'll be reading it as like a reading like article rather than reading it for a template, right? Um, the function is the flow, right? The argumentation, how it constructs its narrative. Whether the introduction introduces, an example or an anecdote, or it like sets out all of the evidence there, or, what actually do I need to include, right? Even step by step, like making it really granular so you understand what goes into your particular subject's um, type of essay, because it will be different for each subject. Um, so the way to do that is to do the reverse outlining that we were talking about before. Reverse outlining, super simple, reading the whole thing and sort of translating it into, not the content of what it's doing, but the function. And then you will have your own little template. And you'll have one that makes sense to you because there are some ones that'll, show you, for example, it might be like a dialectic essay, which is quite like a simplistic way of like showing, you have sort of the yes, no, maybe sort of function of like the different paragraphs of like your idea, someone else's idea, and then the, connection between the two. Um, those can be quite sort of like rigid. If you create your own reverse outline, however, you can make it whatever you want, basically. You sort of write it in a way that makes sense to you, I mean. So I do think it is worth the work of creating your own template because it'll spark ideas, I think. If you have sort of all the reading and the ideas in your mind, you can think, oh, that's a great idea. That's a great place to put this, and that's a great place to put that. And oh, that gives me an idea of how I can sort of order these things because actually it's going to be in the opposite order to what I was thinking, for example. Um, so yeah, if you are struggling with um, getting started and with writer's block, then using these sort of like scaffolding things can be super, super useful. So I do recommend it. Okay, so finally, we're going to be talking a little bit about style and getting your point across and sort of flow and things like that. And then we'll have a little break and then we'll talk about proofreading. So we'll go through style now. Um, so the first one I think that I want to talk about is obscurantism. I have a burning passion against articles that are complicated for complicatedness's sake, right? Your writing is to be read, you know? All academic writing is communicating ideas. And yes, it should be, you don't have to, simplify your ideas, but actually, complex ideas do not require really complex, overly complex writing. Um, and in a way, it kind of makes it look like you're disguising something sometimes when you use overly complicated language, when you use a lot of jargon, when you use a lot of abstract language. It can be a way of like disguising quite like a simple idea or an idea that's not fully formed by, couching it in all of this quite obscure language. So I think before we talk about anything to do with style, we want to liberate ourselves of this idea that we need to create super complicated sentences and privilege above all else clarity, right? Having a really lucid, clear sense of what you're getting across. Um, so the sort of like holy grail of, academic writing style books is this Elements of Style by Strunk and White. They think of the reader as a man floundering in a swamp, right? Your reader is already on the back foot when he goes into a piece of writing. It's brand new to him, it's a new idea, and that person needs saving, right? And so the sooner that you can do a simple sentence that just grounds the idea, if you can give examples, if you can, write things in a really clear way, then you create something that is a lot more pro-reader and is super more um, engaging, and will ultimately then get higher marks, basically. But also will give you more satisfaction out of your reading, your writing ultimately. Okay, so let's talk about style. These are some quite dense bullet points, but they are really fun. So Helen Sword, in her book Stylish Academic Writing, did a big sort of survey of all the academics in her faculty or her university, and she asked them basically what they considered stylish. And so in those results that she got, she found a bunch of common threads. Right, so the number one is interesting, eye-catching titles and subtitles. Immediately, I know that you guys will have things coming to your mind. I know that I had a very funny one about Coriolanus. I'm sure you can sort of guess what the title played on in the title Coriolanus with the Shakespeare play. Um, and yeah, immediately it makes you want to read on and read more. Um, Also catchy opening paragraphs that recount a story. Yeah, you can put yourself into the essay as well, but also asking a challenging question, dissecting a problem. These ways of hooking and holding the reader, right? Um, this is not just a way of being engaging, but also a way of like centering the essay, right? Every essay ultimately has a promise, and then fulfills or doesn't fulfill the promise by the end of it. But like making sure that that first paragraph is all about promise to the reader um, is important and engaging, right? So it's not just a case of like, I'm just going to make this a really entertaining essay. I'm actually going to really like focus my ideas. So like this essay has a really clear question, and it's an interesting question, and it's useful for these following reasons. And that's self-evident in the way that you write your essay. Um, so also concrete nouns are something that can be considered like safe, firm ground as opposed to like the swamp of abstract nouns. So in sort of regular conversational speech, we use a lot more concrete nouns than abstract nouns, whereas in academic writing, things are really vague a lot of the time. So going through your writing and looking for all the abstract nouns, do all of them have a specific meaning? Have you used all of these words intentionally? And the same can be said for energetic active verbs as opposed to forms of be, and things like make, find, show. These are quite like bland and also quite vague as well. So they don't often have the specificity that a more active verb would have. Um, so, for example, if you were to say like this essay is a demonstration of blah blah blah. Actually, it would be better to say this essay demonstrates, or even I demonstrate, right? For example. Also, a good stylish essay, according to Helen Sword, includes illustrations. I think this is something that like people feel really like that they can't do, but it's something that, you know, actually, according to Helen Sword, is one of the hallmarks of a really stylish and engaging essay. And there's nothing to say that you can't. So I think it is something that people should include more of personally. Also, references to a broad range of sources, both within and outside of your field. This is a way to be interesting, basically. All of the best and most innovative essays are in some way interdisciplinary, according to me. I don't, your supervisor might have different sort of advice, but I always think it is sort of surprising and refreshing to see some, maths in a English essay or to see some science in a history essay, for example. And it can be that like element of surprise can really rejuvenate the sort of engagement of a reader. And also humor, explicit or understated, can go a long way. And I think, talk to your supervisor about this, but um, essays do not have to be a place of just total banality. I think it's not just that like you want your reader to understand. I think you want your reader to sympathize and to be on side. So there is a massively like rhetorical element in essay writing. You're kind of like arguing your point. Um, so yeah, humor I think has its place in academic writing, personally. Um, so the other one is to not be afraid of I and you. This is basically agreed upon in most faculties. I think all of them, in fact, allow the use of personal pronouns. Um, I think when I was doing my research, there was like one history journal that doesn't allow personal pronouns, but that's it. The rest of history does. So do not feel as though you absolutely cannot use the word I or me in the entire essay because it's simply not true. Of course, if you use, extremely personal language and you start talking about, the Cheerios you had for breakfast, of course, that's not going to fly in an academic essay. However, putting your own perspective is entirely permissible and oftentimes preferable, actually, in an essay. I think sometimes the impression is that using your own perspective can seem biased or seem like you're putting a sort of, yeah, a tilt on what you're writing. But if you say hands up, like um, this is me, um, you know, coming at this article from a certain way and, addressing that, I think that is more honest than disguising it. And, as it looks in the second point, like anthropomorphizing the essay, putting all of the agency away from you and into the essay can be almost more sort of like manipulative than just putting up your hands and saying, this idea comes from me personally. Yeah, so again, also like these, like avoiding personal pronouns can produce quite strange sentences. So that's another reason to just use them because it's totally fine to use them. And also using the second person pronoun, again, really ups the engagement. So I've just got this sample sentence. Look back at your parents' decision to bring you into the world. This is the start of like a psychology or a philosophy essay, for example. But this use of imperative, look, and also all of these second person pronouns as well, are totally permissible and I think a good part of a stylish essay. Not losing the thread is a really important part of style. This is again being pro-reader. So I think as a philosophy of writing, being pro-reader is one of the most important things that you can do. So reverse outlining your writing, making sure that you are really aware of where the essay goes, sort of from start to end. Um, so having your draft, creating an outline from that draft, and then you can number each of the paragraphs and then maybe move them around and see sort of how the argument is developing. But also you can just ask yourself a bunch of questions about your writing. via the reverse outline that you create. Um, so again, it's coming back to that like the sort of paragraph recipe that we were talking about, the peel, point, evidence, explain, link. Do they all link? Do they all have the right amount of evidence, for example? Um, would anyone have trouble following this? Am I signposting well enough on the first sentence of the paragraph? Do any of my paragraphs repeat, for example? So a lot of the time, it might be that like your essay can be a little bit repetitive and you just wouldn't tell because you're like too like deep into the essay. So reverse outlining it can pull some of these things out. And then also the reverse as well, a paragraph that juggles several topics might need to be split apart as well. Um, okay, so we are a little bit running over time, so I'll just do a short little break of 3 minutes, I think, if that's okay. And then we'll go into proofreading. So if anyone needs the toilet, if anyone needs a drink of water, we'll come back at yeah, 11:13, and I'll see you then for a bit of proofreading. Okay. I know that was quite a short break. I'm just quite aware of the time. I don't want to run over for any of you who have places to be. Um, but we're going to go a little bit into proofreading as an idea. So this is a part of writing. Um, right? Like I want to emphasize that like writing is not just its own little task that is a sacred and totally distinct thing. It's a process that involves also the reading, also the editing, also the note making, etc., etc. So proofreading is a huge part of the writing process. Um, so we're just going to yeah, basically show you different things that you can do um, when you've made your essay and you've edited it and you're in that final proofreading phase. Okay, so proofreading is sometimes seen as a synonym for editing, but actually it's something quite different. So editing is these global issues in writing, things like the strength of your argument, your overall structure, things for content as well. Editing I would see as like a even more clear extension of writing itself, right? Like first draft, second draft, third draft, these are all process of writing. Whereas proofreading is a kind of separate thing, right? Like it's only concerned with these surface level issues. For example, spelling, punctuation, and grammar. but also more than that, I think like readability as well. So like flow, for example, as well. Um, so the importance of proofreading. Um, Basically, um, proofreading isn't about the content of the essay. It's about the sort of respectability like that you have towards the reader. It's another pro-reader thing. Um, so it's like if a reader comes across your writing and it is, sort of jumbled up in terms of the spelling, the grammar, then it feels as though like it's almost like a thing of like disrespect, kind of. That's a strong word for it, but it's a way of sort of taking care of your reader, a way. Um, so it is something that's very important. Um, so moving forwards, of course, you guys will have seen these. The things are like homonyms, basically, that sound the same, or homophones, sorry. Um, but yeah, just to be aware. Um, so basically, you cannot rely on your spell checker because of these homophones. So um, as you can see, all of these different things are, technically spelt correctly. However, the spell checker only sort of like checks for things that are a string of characters that are technically spelled correctly, that are in a specific order. So this, I hope, demonstrates why a spell checker isn't, there's something that you can use on its own. So it is still useful to go through your writing at the end, once you've had a bit of time to sort of get distance from your writing, to go into it and see if any of these have taken place, for example. But this is quite a funny poem that I quite enjoy. Um, Also, source unknown, that is part of the poem. That is, yeah, intentional. Um, okay, so I would say, as my key piece of advice for proofreading, is to treat it as separate from editing. So allowing yourself in the editing process to write away and not give yourself too much trouble in terms of things like this, like spelling and grammar, and to, when you do come to proofreading, have given yourself a decent amount of time. Um, so it can be really difficult to see any errors in the text when you're like still working on it. So making sure that you have been able to come away from it for a day or at least, a couple of hours is super, super useful when it comes to proofreading because it's your own writing and you'll have sinking into it. It'll have like sort of mapped itself onto the back of your brain. So sort of disrupting that is key. Um, so another sort of piece of advice that I would give is printing out your document. This is something that I did, and it revolutionized the way that I did. I also use this for editing, but I think proofreading in this way really helped me because, especially at the end of an essay, you're very much like have maybe stared at a screen for a very long time, and so getting away from the screen um, is yeah something that can be like a way to like refresh the brain. But also studies have shown that reading on paper can actually increase comprehension and reading efficiency. It also kind of allows you to interact with it on a tactile level. You've physically got it there, so you have a sort of ownership of it. It's not this sort of abstract thing that's sort of across from you. For some people, that makes a huge difference. Also, unlike this picture, don't forget to double space your draft so that you can have lots of rooms for notes and stuff. Not only will this give you, more room basically to write your corrections, it will also create more space between the words, which will allow you to see them better, so that you'll be able to, help your writing even more. Um, so we've got a couple of tips. Tip number one is to read it out loud. So this is something that I hope you guys are doing already. This can be something that's really fun to do with your friends as well, or even with your supervisor. This is something that I know a lot of the writing consultants do. So I don't know if you know that we have writing consultants that you can book, but they're super useful. And one thing they'll do is to see if you have that sort of clarity, that sort of pro-reader like sense. It can be a really good way to process the information that like disrupts that like flow of like writing where you maybe can't see it because you've been reading for so long. Reading it out loud can sort of stop that. Um, so pronouncing every single word as well can make sure that you like get the flow of it and see if anything needs to be cut out. Um, and also it stops you from skipping words because I think there is in reading, especially if you're a quick reader, the brain doesn't sort of take in every single word. Speed readers can even just like jump from the page where they like do the entire first paragraph in like two glances, right? So reading out loud can force you to say every single word. But also, if it helps, you can use your finger to follow along. So that can help you from skipping words as well. Um, Similarly, reading it with a ruler. So you can also do this with a folded piece of paper. You can do this with anything kind of that's got a straight edge. Kind of works with a similar principle. It allows you to focus on just one sentence or just, the one line. And so reducing all of that extra noise can be really useful to be able to see what you're working on so that you remove that sort of extraneous distraction. Tip number three, I would use for punctuation in particular is circling every single bit of punctuation that you come across. There is a temptation. You come to the end of the essay, you have to proofread it, so you just go through it really quickly, and then you finish it and you're like, it's fine. A way to slow down is to circle every bit of punctuation that you come across. You could even slow down even further by using different colors for different punctuation and pause and say, is this making sense? Do I really need this comma here? Is this a semicolon or is it a colon regular? For example, um, it can make sure that you're hitting every single bit of punctuation. Because if you're anything like me, at the end of an essay, you want to speed through it. So there has to be ways to slow down. Um, Tip number four. Um, with electronic documents, you can use text-to-speech or screen reading software. And so this is really useful because you can, listen to it on the go while you're like tidying your room, for example, or cooking. You can control a lot of the elements of it, so the speed of it, but also the start and end point. So you can just do a paragraph, for example. You can do this multiple times as well. So every time you do a new draft, you can listen to it and see how it sounds. It's just another way of digesting the information that isn't reading, um, which is really useful. Um, so that is a useful tip. Um, Number five is to manipulate your text. So a lot of these ways are basically trying to like digest the text in a new way so that it feels new. Because once you've, spent a lot of time with an essay, it'll just seem like, paste on a page. But actually, if you increase the font size, for example, if you move things around, you could isolate a text by, pressing tab on the paragraph to move it in. Um, you can press the enter key after each sentence. You can change the font, for example. Um, so all of these ways basically like defamiliarize the writing. Because yeah, it'll just be crazy familiar to you, and it'll be basically impossible to see where things are going wrong if it's in the same format as when you wrote it. So these are the things that I would recommend. Um, okay, fabulous. And then the final tip that we have is outsourcing. So 100% the best way to proofread is to enlist the help of a friend and to offer to proofread their work. So this is really good because it inherently um, defamiliarizes the text because it's not your own text and they'll be able to see a lot better. Um, but we also have a proofreading service. So I don't know if you guys know about this, but it's located under the writing support on the library website. If you scroll all the way down, you'll see proofreading right at the end. And we actually do have a number of fellows and other volunteers who, yeah, is a totally voluntary service. So sometimes it takes a bit of time, to match you up with a proofreader. But once we do, they are incredibly useful and incredibly, yeah, helpful and generous and kind. to provide a proofreading service for different students. So if you are struggling with proofreading, then I hope these tips are helpful for you. If you are proofreading the work of a friend, then using the things that I've shown you, circling the punctuation, um, you know, using the ruler, reading it out loud, especially reading it out loud to a friend, really helpful. I think these things are super useful. So that brings me to the end of my talk. This is the previous librarian's name, but that's okay. Um, so if you do have any questions, you can email me at academicskills@wolfson.cam.ac.uk. But also ask me any questions now. I'll stay on the call for another couple minutes. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone. I hope that was helpful.
So Connor, will you be able to send us the presentation